A blind boy rescues a dying horse from the slaughterhouse. No one imagined the weakest pair would leave the crowd breathless, then erupting with shock. Blind boy, you think you can walk like us? Stay home next time. The taunt sliced through the crisp morning air, sharp as broken glass. Peter froze, his fingers tightening around the worn handle of his cane. He didn't need eyes to know who it was. That voice belonged to Jimmy Miller, the loudest, meanest kid in town. The sound of gravel crunching under sneakers told Peter the others were with him, circling like buzzards. A chorus of laughter followed. Peter felt his cheeks burn, the familiar ache of helplessness curling in his stomach. He shifted on his feet, searching for the steady, reassuring grip of his grandfather's hand. "Back off, you little punks!" The deep growl of Paulo Martinez cut through the commotion like a crack of thunder. Heavy footsteps thudded forward, and Peter heard the kids scatter. Jimmy cursed under his breath before sprinting away. Gravel skidded across the ground as the group retreated into the crowd. "You hear me?" Paulo barked after them. "Next time I catch you near my grandson, you'll wish you hadn't." The market square fell silent for a moment. Peter stood still, listening to the fading footsteps, the awkward shuffling of passers-by who'd stopped to watch. The shame settled deep. Not because of the kids' words, but because his grandfather had to chase them off like stray dogs. "They're gone now, kid," Paulo said, his voice softening. His strong hand closed around Peter's shoulder. "Don't let 'em get to you." Peter gave a small nod, swallowing the familiar lump of shame lodged in his throat. He adjusted his cap and turned his face toward the sounds around him. The creak of wooden carts, the murmur of vendors calling out their prices, and the distant, steady clank of a blacksmith at work. But the laughter echoed in his mind, dragging him back to a different place. The orphanage had always smelled of bleach and old prayers, and sometimes blood. Peter could still feel the cold stone beneath his bare feet as he stood in the kitchen, fumbling to peel potatoes with a rusted knife. "Useless," Sister Amelia had hissed, cane tapping against the tiled floor. "What good is a boy who can't even see? God cursed you, boy, and he cursed us by leaving you here." The crack of the cane landing across his shoulders had sent him sprawling, the blade clattering to the floor. The pain was sharp, but the words had cut deeper. That night, Peter had waited until the building settled into the heavy silence of sleep. He'd pushed open the kitchen window, slipping into the cold night, running until his legs gave out. He remembered lying in a field, breathless and sobbing, convinced he'd rather die there than go back. That was before he ran. Before the night he slipped through the kitchen window, barefoot and trembling, running from the orphanage and the endless blows. The night he'd collapsed in a field, thinking he'd die there, until Paulo found him. The old man took him home, gave him soup, a bed, and something Peter never thought he'd feel. Safe. "Peter?" The boy flinched as Paulo's voice pulled him back to the present. "You okay, kid?" "Yeah," Peter said quickly, straightening. "Yeah, I'm fine." "Come on," Paulo said gently. "We didn't come here to fight with fools. We came for a horse." Peter fell into step beside him, tapping his cane lightly against the cobblestones. The morning sun warmed his face as they moved deeper into the market. The smell of hay mixed with the tang of manure and the sweet, sticky scent of candied apples from the vendor's stall on the corner. They passed row after row of stalls, each one holding horses that shifted and snorted behind wooden railings. Peter heard proud owners brag about bloodlines and racing records. The animals stomped and neighed, their hooves sharp against the dirt. The voices blurred together until suddenly one sound pierced through, a breath, slow, shallow, defeated. Peter stopped so abruptly that Paulo nearly tripped over him. "What is it?" Paulo asked. "That breathing," Peter said, tilting his head toward the sound. "It's different." He turned toward the noise, extending his hand. The cane tapped against a wooden post. He slid his fingers along the rough surface, following the sound until he reached a narrow gap in the stall. His fingertips brushed against coarse fur stretched thin over bone. The horse didn't move, just stood there, breathing in slow, broken rhythms. "Hey," Peter whispered. The horse exhaled, warm air puffing against his palm. The animal trembled but didn't pull away. Beneath the rough fur and sharp ribs, Peter felt it. Fear, like the kind that had lived inside his chest for so long. The kind that no one else ever oftly. That lonely, hollow place. "That one's no good, kid," a man said behind him. Peter stiffened. The voice was slick and oily, like the sound of boots on wet mud. The man's footsteps shuffled closer, and Peter caught the sharp smell of tobacco and sweat. "Been trying to get rid of that nag for weeks," the man continued. "No one's stupid enough to buy it. Weak legs, scared of its own shadow, just a useless piece of meat." Peter felt Tizon's breath quicken. The horse shifted, its fear bleeding into the air. The man's voice sounded just like Sister Amelia's back at the orphanage, cold, dismissive. He remembered the sting of her cane, the way she'd sneer, "You're broken, Peter. God made you wrong." Peter clenched his teeth. His hand steadied on the horse's muzzle. "I want it." The man laughed. "You want that? Boy, you got screws loose or something?" "Peter," Paolo said softly, stepping beside him. "We can look at other horses, stronger ones." "No," Peter said, his voice firm. "This one needs me." The man spat on the ground. $100. Take it or leave it." "That's robbery," Paolo snapped. "You said it yourself. The animal's worthless." "Yeah, well," the man sneered. "I was going to send it to the slaughterhouse anyway. Least they'll pay me by the pound. Meat's worth more than the trouble of keeping it alive." He sniffed loudly, wiping his nose with the back of his hand. "So if you want it, better pay up now. Otherwise, next week it's hanging in a meat truck." Peter froze. His fingers dug into the wiry mane beneath his palm. The image of this frightened, broken animal being dragged onto a truck, hearing the sounds of other terrified creatures, made his stomach turn. He knew that fear, that helplessness, too well. His hand shot into his jacket pocket. His fingers brushed against the crumpled bills he'd saved for almost a year. Money from cleaning the neighbor's chicken coop, collecting cans along the roadside, fixing old fences with Paolo. He held the wad out. "I got 75. That's all I have." The man snatched the money. "Done. One less problem for me." The stall creaked open. Peter heard the man's boots scuff away as the gate slammed shut. Tizon stood still, legs trembling. Peter stepped forward and placed his hand on the horse's neck. The animal flinched, its skin twitching under his palm. "It's okay," Peter whispered. "I'm here." Tizon hesitated, then leaned into the touch. The tension in the muscles beneath Peter's hand loosened. The horse's breathing slowed. "Let's get him home," Paolo said, voice rough with unspoken worry. As they led Tizon through the market, Peter ignored the murmurs around them. He didn't care what the crowd thought. Every step the horse took was shaky, uncertain, just like Peter had been the first time he tried walking with a cane through town. "What are you going to name him?" Paolo asked as they neared the truck. Peter ran his hand along Tizon's neck. "Tizon," he said, like a coal ember. "Coal?" Paolo sounded surprised. "Why coal?" "Because coal looks cold and dead," Peter said, "but if you touch it, there's warmth underneath, and if you give it enough time, it burns again." Paolo didn't respond for a moment. Then he let out a long, low whistle. "That's a good name, son. A strong name." Peter turned toward the horse, letting the scents and sounds of the market fade. His hand rested just behind Tizon's ears. "From now on," Peter whispered, "we're not going to be scared anymore. You and me, buddy. We're going to show 'em what we're made of." The horse let out a soft, shuddering breath. a sound like the last ember of a fire catching the wind. Peter smiled. The journey had begun. When the truck finally lurched to a stop, Paolo cut the engine and stepped out with a grunt. The back door creaked open, flooding the trailer with the sounds of birds and the soft rustle of wind through the trees. Tizon's ears twitched and its muscles tensed beneath Peter's hand. "Come on, boy," Peter coaxed. "Let's get you out of here." Tizon hesitated but let Peter guide it down the ramp. Its hooves clinked against the metal, uncertain and slow. When they reached solid ground, the horse froze, nostrils flaring at the unfamiliar scents of the farm. Paolo crossed his arms and watched the bony creature standing beside his grandson. "Peter, are you sure about this?" His voice was gentle, but the doubt in it was clear. A horse that's scared. A body can't fix that overnight. Peter turned his face toward the sound of his grandfather's voice. "I know it won't be easy," he said, "but I can feel it. Tizon still wants to fight. He just needs someone to believe in him." Paolo exhaled slowly. "All right. But you remember this. Sometimes, even love ain't enough to fix what's been broken." Peter nodded, though his jaw tightened. He gripped the lead rope and started walking toward the old wooden barn. The gravel crunched under his boots. He listened to the rhythm of the steps behind him, 4 uncertain hooves hesitating with every stride. Inside the barn, Peter guided Tizon into a stall lined with fresh straw. The horse sniffed the ground, shuffled its feet, then backed into the corner, pressing itself against the rough wooden wall. Peter crouched by the feed trough. He scooped a handful of oats from the bucket, letting them spill between his fingers. "Hear that, Tizon?" he said softly, running his hand along the edge of the trough so the horse could hear the sound of grain cascading against wood. "It's yours, fresh and clean." Tizon stretched its neck forward, nostrils twitching. But when its lips brushed the feed, the horse jerked its head back and retreated once more to the corner. Peter's heart sank. He rubbed the back of his neck, trying to push away the memory that crept into his mind. The nights in the orphanage when hunger gnawed at his belly, and he'd sit by the kitchen door just to smell the bread cooling on the counter. Sometimes Sister Amelia tossed him scraps. More often, she didn't. Behind him, Paolo leaned against the stall door. "He's scared of more than just hunger, kid." Peter stood and gave a small nod. "Yeah, I know." That night, Peter dragged his blanket into the barn and spread it on the straw outside Tizon's stall. He sat down and rested his back against the wooden wall. The barn smelled of hay and old leather, familiar and calming. Tizon shifted in the corner, breathing fast and shallow. Peter tilted his head toward the sound. "I know what it's like to feel like that," he murmured. "To be scared all the time." The horse didn't move. "There was a place I lived before I met Grandpa. The people there, they didn't like me much, said I wasn't good for anything." He hesitated, the words catching in his throat. "I used to sit by myself in a corner, just like you're doing now. I figured if I didn't move, maybe they'd forget I was there." The barn was silent except for the faint creak of the rafters. Peter leaned his head against the wall and began whistling a tune, the same one Paolo used to hum while rocking him to sleep after a nightmare. A slow, gentle melody, like a lullaby whispered by the wind. At first, Tizon didn't react, but after a few minutes the breathing shifted, slowing slightly. Peter kept whistling, his voice never wavering. Then came the faintest sound, soft steps on straw. Peter held his breath as the horse came closer, each step cautious but steady. Warm breath brushed his arm. He didn't move until he felt Tizon's muzzle nudge his hand. Slowly he raised his palm, letting the horse rest its head there. "See," Peter whispered, "we can trust each other." He fell asleep with the horse's breath warm against his skin. By sunrise, when Paolo walked into the barn with a steaming mug of coffee, he stopped short at the sight before him. Peter was still asleep on the straw, his hand resting on Tizon's muzzle. Paolo smiled and shook his head. Maybe trust is the best medicine after all. Later that morning, Peter filled the feed trough again and whistled softly as Tizon stood nearby. The horse hesitated, then took a cautious step forward. Its muzzle dipped into the oats, and Peter heard the faint crunch of teeth grinding grain. The boy's chest tightened with relief. He crouched beside the trough and laid his hand on Tizon's neck. "That's it, buddy. Just take it slow." Over the next few days, Tizon's appetite returned. The hollow dip along its spine softened, and its ribs became less pronounced. Its steps grew steadier. A week later, Peter stood by the barn door, gripping the lead rope. "Ready for a walk outside, Tizon?" he asked. The horse shifted its weight, uncertain. Peter whistled their familiar tune and gave the rope a gentle tug. Tizon took one step, then another, and followed him into the sunlight. As they walked past the fence line, Paolo watched from the porch. He sipped his coffee and smiled. "Damn if they ain't made for each other," he muttered. Peter paused and raised his face toward the warmth of the sun. Beside him, Tizon snorted and nudged his shoulder. "Yeah, buddy," Peter said, giving the horse a pat. "We're gonna be okay." The morning air hung heavy with the smell of damp earth and hay as Peter led Tizon into the backyard. The ground beneath his boots was soft from last night's rain, each step sinking slightly into the mud. He stopped in the middle of the practice area, a patch of open dirt behind the barn, and turned his head, listening to the familiar sounds of the farm waking up. Birds chattered in the oak tree by the fence. The wind rustled through the tall grass along the fence line. From the distance came the metallic clank of Paolo's tools in the workshop. But there was something else too, the steady rhythm of Tizon's breathing beside him, the nervous flick of the horse's ears catching unfamiliar sounds. Peter smiled faintly. "We're gonna figure this out, buddy," he said, patting the horse's neck. "We just gotta learn how to listen." Tizon shifted its weight, stamping one hoof uncertainly. The horse had grown stronger in the past weeks, ribs less prominent beneath its dark coat. But the fear was still there, lingering in every step, in every twitch when a sound caught it off guard. Peter ran his fingers along the lead rope. "Okay," he said, voice steady. "We're gonna start with the basics." He stood facing the barn and gave a short, sharp whistle, one clear note that cut through the morning air. "That means, go forward," he said aloud. He took a step forward, clicking his tongue softly. "Come on, Tizon, just like we practiced." The horse hesitated, hooves scraping the ground. Peter stood still, hand outstretched, waiting. After a long pause, Tizon took a step forward, then another. "There we go," Peter said with a grin. "You're getting it." Over the next hour, they repeated the process. One whistle for go, 2 short whistles for turn right, 3 for turn left, and 4 for jump. The horse's responses were slow and uncertain, but Peter didn't mind. He felt the tension gradually ease from Tizon's body, heard the shift in the animal's breathing from shallow and quick to slower, more measured. But the trust didn't come all at once. As Peter guided Tizon around the practice area, a sharp crack split the air. The sound came from the neighboring property, the whip from old Mr. Thompson's training ring. Tizon froze, its ears flattened. Then it reared back, eyes wide with terror. The lead rope burned Peter's palm as the horse wrenched away from him. "Tizon, wait!" The horse bolted toward the fence. Peter ran after it, cane tapping against the ground as he tried to track the frantic hoofbeats. His foot caught on a clump of mud, and he went down hard, knees scraping against gravel. The rope slipped through his fingers, the sting sharp and sudden. By the time Peter pushed himself up, Tizon had backed into a corner of the yard, sides heaving. Peter approached slowly, raising his hands to show he held nothing. He knelt a few feet away, breathing heavily. "It's okay," he said softly. "It's just a sound. It can't hurt you." Tizon snorted and tossed its head, hooves shuffling nervously. Peter dropped his voice to a whisper. "I know what it feels like to hear something and just freeze. Like that sound's gonna bring back everything bad." He stretched out a hand. "But it doesn't have to. I promise." The horse's breath slowed. After a moment, it stepped forward, lowering its head toward his outstretched palm. Peter stroked the damp fur and exhaled shakily. Behind him, the barn door creaked open. "You all right, boy?" Paolo asked, voice low. His footsteps crunched on the gravel. "Yeah," Peter said. "We just had a scare." Paolo stood beside him, looking at the dark streaks of mud on his grandson's jeans and the rope burn on his palms. "That noise," he said, glancing toward the neighboring fence. "Sounded like a whip." Peter nodded. "Yeah, Tizon lost it when he heard it." Paolo rested a hand on the boy's shoulder. "That horse has been hurt bad, Peter. Animals, remember, same way people do." "I know," Peter whispered. He stroked Tizon's neck. "But I'm not giving up." That night, Peter lay awake in bed, replaying the moment Tizon had bolted. The panic in the horse's movements, the wild desperation in its breath. It was the same fear he used to feel at the orphanage when Sister Amelia's footsteps echoed down the hall. He sat up and swung his legs over the side of the bed. Quietly, he crept downstairs, grabbed his blanket, and slipped into the barn. Tizon stirred when Peter entered the stall. The boy spread the blanket on the straw and sat down. "I'm here," he said softly. "We'll figure it out. Together." The night was long and cold, but Peter didn't leave. By morning, Paolo found them there, both asleep, the boy's hand resting lightly on the horse's muzzle. He stood for a long while before shaking his head. "Stubborn as a mule, both of them," he muttered, but the corners of his mouth twitched in a smile. 2 days later, a storm rolled in from the west. Peter heard it before anyone else, the distant grumble of thunder, low and steady, like the growl of a waking beast. He stood in the barn beside Tizon, running a brush along the horse's side. "You hear that?" Peter said softly. The horse's ears twitched, its muscles tensed. The wind picked up, rattling the barn doors. A crack of lightning split the sky. Thunder followed, sharp and sudden. Tizon reared, kicking the air with panicked force. The brush dropped from Peter's hand as the horse backed into the stall wall, eyes wide with terror. Peter didn't think. He lunged forward, wrapping his arms around the horse's neck. "I'm here!" he shouted. The horse's muscles trembled beneath his grasp. "It's just noise, just sound. Stay with me." Behind him, the barn door banged open. "Peter!" Paolo's voice was sharp. "We're okay!" Peter called back, though his heart raced in his chest. The thunder rumbled again, fainter this time. Tizon sagged against Peter, sides heaving. The boy ran his hands along the animal's neck, whispering reassurance. Paolo stepped inside, wiping rain from his brow. Damn storm came out of nowhere. His eyes scanned the stall. "You held him?" Peter nodded. His arms ached, but he didn't let go. That night, as the rain drummed against the roof, Paolo pulled a chair beside Peter's bed. "You know," the old man said, "I had a horse once, named Rusty. That animal was scared of storms his whole life." "How'd you help him?" Peter asked. "Didn't at first. Tried everything. One night, though, I sat with him through a storm. Let him hear my voice, feel my hand on his neck. After that, every time it stormed, I'd just talk to him. He still got scared, but he knew I was there." Peter mulled that over. "So, you never fixed the fear?" "No. But I showed him he didn't have to face it alone." The next morning, Peter grabbed an old bandana from the shelf. He walked to the barn and tied it gently over Tizon's eyes. "Today we practice trust," he said. The horse balked at first, tossing its head, but Peter kept his hand on the rope, whistling softly. Hear me. Feel me. That's all you need. Tizon hesitated, then took one step, another. Peter led the horse around the yard, using only his voice and the rope. By noon, Tizon followed each command without hesitation. When Peter removed the blindfold, the horse blinked in the sunlight and nudged his arm. From the porch, Paolo sipped his coffee and said, almost to himself, "Those two, there's something special." Peter smiled, running his hand down Tizon's neck. "See, buddy," he whispered, "the world doesn't seem so scary when you listen the right way." Tizon let out a low, contented snort, and for the first time, when a distant crack of thunder rolled across the sky, the horse didn't flinch. The sun rose over the small town of Clearwater, casting long shadows across the dirt arena behind the fairgrounds. The crisp autumn air carried the sharp tang of horses, hay, and fried dough from the nearby food stands. Peter stood by the fence, one hand resting on Tizon's neck, the other tapping the wooden post with his cane. The crowd buzzed beyond the fence line, voices low but not quiet enough to hide their disbelief. "Is that the blind kid?" a man muttered. "Yeah, him and that scrawny horse. What a joke." Peter felt the heat rise in his face, but he kept his chin up. He wasn't here for them. He was here for Tizon and for himself. "Ready, buddy?" he asked softly. Tizon huffed, shifting beneath the leather saddle. Peter gave the horse's neck a reassuring pat. They'd been practicing for weeks, counting strides, memorizing the track layout Paolo had described over and over, and fine-tuning the whistle commands. The steps were etched into Peter's mind now, as clear as the lines of Braille under his fingertips. "Let's show 'em what we've got," Peter said. The crowd's murmurs followed them as they made their way toward the starting gate. Peter heard someone chuckle, then a boy's voice. "He'll probably fall off before the first jump." He tightened his grip on the reins. "Don't listen, Tizon," he whispered. "We know better." From behind the fence, Paolo called out, "Remember the steps, Peter. Count 'em like we practiced." Peter gave a small nod. His grandfather's voice was steady as always, a lighthouse beam in the fog. The gate creaked open. The announcer's voice crackled through the loudspeaker. "Next up, contestant number 23. Peter Martinez and his horse, Tizon." The crowd shifted. Some clapped politely, others didn't bother. Peter turned Tizon toward the track. In his mind, he walked through the course one last time. 30 steps straight to the first jump, then a right turn after 25 steps. 3 jumps total. He'd counted them so many times that they lived in his bones. He leaned forward and gave a single sharp whistle. Tizon surged forward. The wind rushed past Peter's face as the horse galloped across the packed dirt. The rhythm of the hoofbeats was solid beneath him. 1-2, 1-2. Peter counted under his breath. The crowd's noise faded into the background. Only the steps mattered. 28, 29, 30. Peter gave 4 short whistles, the signal to jump. Tizon responded instantly, pushing off the ground. Peter gripped the reins tight, leaning with the motion. He felt the brief, weightless moment when the horse cleared the bar, then the solid impact of hooves hitting the ground. The crowd let out a collective gasp. Someone whistled in surprise. "Good job, buddy," Peter said, breathless. "Now right turn." He gave 2 short whistles. Tizon veered right, just as they'd practiced. Peter counted again, matching the beat of the hooves to the steps in his mind. At step 25, he gave the jump command. The second jump was higher, but Tizon didn't hesitate. The horse launched into the air, clearing the bar cleanly. The crowd noise swelled. They hit the ground running. Peter leaned in. "Last one, Tizon. We got this." He counted the strides toward the final jump. But at step 15, the horse hesitated. Peter felt the shift, the break in rhythm, the tightening of Tizon's muscles. The jump was coming, but the horse's fear was creeping in. "It's okay," Peter whispered. "Trust me." He gave 4 whistles. The horse faltered. Peter gripped the reins tighter. "Trust me," he said again. The next stride came, and Tizon leaped. The takeoff was rough, the jump uneven. Peter held his breath. The horse's front hooves cleared the bar. The back hooves clipped it, sending the pole tumbling with a sharp crack. The crowd gasped. Tizon landed hard but didn't stumble. Peter let out the breath he'd been holding. They crossed the finish line seconds later. The cheers were louder than he'd expected. Peter slowed the horse to a trot, then a walk. His heart pounded. Paolo was waiting by the gate, voice tight with pride. "You did it, kid." Peter slid off Tizon's back and stroked the horse's damp neck. "We did it." When the results were announced, Peter and Tizon placed third. Standing on the podium, Peter listened to the crowd. The disbelief was still there, but now it came with a thread of something different. Respect. The story spread faster than Peter expected. By the next morning, the local paper ran a headline: "Blind boy and rescued horse defy odds in town competition." Peter sat at the kitchen table, running his fingers over the raised letters of the Braille version Paolo had transcribed for him. He traced the words slowly. Peter Martinez, 12, and his horse Tizon demonstrated an extraordinary bond, guiding each other through obstacles with instinct and trust. Paolo chuckled from across the room. "Didn't think we'd make the papers, did you?" Peter shook his head. "Feels weird." "Good weird or bad weird?" Peter thought for a second. "Both." The phone rang later that afternoon. Paolo answered and frowned as he listened. "Yeah, well, I'll ask the boy. No promises." He hung up and turned toward Peter. "Some fella named Rodrigo Montalvo wants to meet with us. Says he's got an offer." The man arrived the next morning in a shiny black truck. His boots clicked against the porch steps as he approached. "Well, well," Rodrigo said, stretching out his hand. The famous Peter and his miracle horse. Peter didn't move to shake the man's hand. Something in Rodrigo's voice felt off. Too smooth, too practiced. Rodrigo's smile didn't waver. "I saw the article," he said. "Impressive stuff, especially considering, well, your circumstances." Peter's jaw tightened. "I'm here with an opportunity," Rodrigo continued. "I'll give you 500 grand for that horse." Peter's head snapped up. $500,000? Rodrigo laughed. "Yep, cash. Tizon's a star, kid. I can make him famous." Peter shook his head. "He's not for sale." The man's smile thinned. "Think about it. That kind of money could change your life." Peter took a step back, hand resting on Tizon's shoulder. "We're not selling him." Rodrigo's eyes narrowed. "Suit yourself." He turned and walked away, boots thudding against the porch. Before getting into his truck, he glanced back. "You'll regret it, boy." That night, Peter woke to the sound of splintering wood. He grabbed his cane and ran to the barn. The main gate was wide open. The lock had been cut. "Tizon!" Peter called, heart racing. He swept his cane across the floor, searching for broken boards or tracks. From the far corner came a soft, familiar breath. Peter moved toward the sound. The horse was there, standing still in the shadows. He laid a hand on Tizon's neck. "They tried to take you." The horse nuzzled his shoulder. Behind him, Paolo appeared, rifle in hand. "Someone cut the lock," he said grimly. Peter ran his hand along Tizon's mane. "They're not going to scare us away." The next morning, the mail arrived with an official envelope. Paolo opened it and read aloud, "Invitation to the National Equestrian Championship." Peter straightened. His fingers found the paper and traced the embossed letters. He smiled faintly. "We're going." "Even after last night?" Paolo asked. Peter's jaw tightened. "Especially after last night." The morning after the letter arrived, Peter sat at the kitchen table, running his fingers over the raised braille letters of the invitation. National Equestrian Championship, Denver, Colorado. The words felt big, almost too big to be real. The championship was less than 2 months away. They had work to do. Beside him, Paolo sipped his coffee. "You sure about this, kid? This ain't a small-town event. It's the best of the best." Peter set the paper down and straightened in his chair. "We've come this far, Grandpa. We can go a little farther." Paolo chuckled softly. "You sound just like your grandma when you say things like that." He set his mug down and rubbed his hands together. "All right then, let's get to work." By noon they were out back, standing in the middle of the training field. The sun beat down on the dry earth, and cicadas buzzed in the distance. Paolo had set up makeshift obstacles, barrels stacked for turns, poles balanced on hay bales to mimic jumps. Peter held the reins loosely as Tizon shifted beside him. The horse's ears twitched, picking up the unfamiliar sounds of the new setup. "Okay," Peter said. "Let's figure this out." He tapped his cane against the ground, then knelt. He ran his fingers across the dirt, feeling the texture, the subtle vibrations from the wind. "What are you doing down there?" Paolo asked from the fence. Peter stood and dusted off his jeans, trying to feel what Tizon feels. He ran his hand along the horse's neck. "When we're close to a jump, the wind changes. The ground feels different when we get near the fence line. I think we can use that." Paolo whistled softly. "Smart." For the next few days, Peter focused on the sounds and sensations of the course. He walked it on foot first, memorizing the patterns of wind, the way sound bounced differently near the barrels than the fence posts. He counted steps from one obstacle to the next, but it didn't always go smoothly. One afternoon, while practicing a jump, Tizon's hoof caught the top rail. The horse stumbled, nearly toppling. Peter slid from the saddle as Tizon scrambled to regain its balance. The pole hit the ground with a dull thud. Peter got to his knees, chest heaving. Tizon stood nearby, sides quivering. Paolo hurried over. "You okay?" Peter nodded. "Yeah." He rubbed his scraped palms together. His voice shook. "We just didn't time it right." Paolo crouched beside him. "Falling ain't what matters, boy. It's what you do after." Peter turned his face toward Tizon. The horse shifted uneasily, ears back. "Come on, buddy," Peter said, climbing to his feet. He grasped the reins. "Let's try again." Tizon resisted at first, pulling back slightly. Peter tightened his grip. "I know you're scared. I am too. But we can't let this stop us." He gave a low, steady whistle. After a few tense moments, the horse followed him back toward the start line. The second attempt wasn't perfect, but they cleared the jump. A week later, Peter led Tizon into the woods beyond the pasture. The air was cooler under the canopy, the ground softer with pine needles. Twigs snapped beneath the horse's hooves. Peter stopped near the creek and dropped the reins. "Okay, buddy. Time to trust." The woods were full of unpredictable sounds. Birds calling from high branches, squirrels rustling through leaves, the soft gurgle of water nearby. Tizon shifted uneasily, ears flicking. Peter stepped back and gave a long, clear whistle. The horse stood still. "Come on, Tizon," Peter said softly. "Follow my voice." He whistled again and moved a few feet away. Tizon hesitated, then took a cautious step forward. "That's it," Peter encouraged. Bit by bit, Tizon followed the sound of Peter's voice through the woods. When a branch cracked nearby, the horse froze, but didn't bolt. By the time they reached the far side of the clearing, Peter ran his hands over Tizon's neck and smiled. "Told you we could do it." The night before they left for the championship, Peter sat on the barn's wooden bench, stroking Tizon's mane. The stars outside glimmered faintly through the half-open door. Paolo appeared, his steps familiar on the worn boards. He lowered himself onto the bench beside his grandson. "Big day tomorrow," Paolo said. Peter gave a small nod. "Yeah." Paolo squeezed Peter's shoulder. "Whatever happens out there, win or lose, I'm proud of you." Peter turned his face toward his grandfather. "Thanks, Grandpa. We'll give it everything we've got." The Denver Equestrian Stadium roared with noise. The air vibrated with announcer chatter, crowd murmurs, and the rhythmic thud of hooves on packed dirt. Peter sat on Tizon's back near the starting gate, heart racing beneath his rib cage. The announcer's voice crackled over the speakers. Next up, Peter Martinez and Tizon, representing Clearwater Ranch. As they moved toward the starting line, the whispers reached his ears. "Is that the blind kid?" "Yeah, and that's the rescue horse. No way they'll make it through this course." Peter leaned forward and pressed his hand against Tizon's neck. The horse's muscles twitched. Its breathing was quick and uneven. "We don't hear them," Peter murmured. "Just each other." The starting horn blasted through the arena. Peter gave a single clear whistle. Tizon surged forward. The track felt different from the practice course. The ground was harder, the fences taller, but the wind still shifted when they neared each jump. Peter counted 30 steps to the first, 27, 28, 29, 30. He gave 4 sharp whistles. Tizon leaped. For a heartbeat, the world was silent. Then the hooves hit the ground with a solid thump. The crowd gasped. They raced toward the second jump. 25 strides this time. Peter's mind tracked the count while his body adjusted to the turns. At stride 24, Tizon faltered. Peter felt it instantly, the break in rhythm, the moment of hesitation. He leaned forward and whispered, "Trust me." He gave the jump command again. Tizon pushed off the ground, barely clearing the rail. The back hooves grazed it, but the pole held. Peter didn't let himself feel the relief. One more jump. They approached the last fence, the tallest one. Peter counted the steps. The wind shifted against his face. The ground changed beneath Tizon's hooves as they neared the jump. He gave the signal. Tizon hesitated. Peter's pulse spiked. He dropped the reins, leaned forward, and placed both hands on the horse's neck. "We can do this," he said, voice steady despite the fear rising in his chest. "I'm with you." He whistled 4 times. The horse surged upward. Peter felt the power coil beneath him, the muscles stretching, the legs kicking. For an eternal second, they floated in the air. The landing was solid. The crowd erupted. The sound hit Peter like a wave. He pulled Tizon to a stop and sat, breathing hard, waiting for the announcement. "Peter Martinez and Tizon have completed the course with a perfect time." The noise doubled. Peter reached forward, gripping Tizon's mane. The horse snorted and tossed its head. Paolo's voice cut through the commotion as he ran toward them. "You did it, Peter! You won!" Later, standing on the winner's platform with the cool weight of the trophy in his hands, Peter turned toward the microphone. The crowd quieted. "I can't see this trophy," he said, voice steady, "but I can feel the heart of the horse who helped me win it. Tizon didn't need perfect eyes, he just needed trust." He paused, hand resting on the horse's neck. "And so did I." That night, Peter sat beside Tizon in the field. The grass was cool beneath his legs. Overhead, the stars shimmered faintly. He ran his fingers through the horse's mane. "You did it, buddy," Peter whispered. "We showed 'em." Tizon gave a soft, contented snort. Peter tilted his face toward the sky and smiled. He didn't need to see the stars to know they were there, shining, steady, guiding him forward. Wow, what a journey, right? Peter and Tizon's story, though fictional, holds a truth we can all connect with. It's a story about trust, resilience, and the kind of quiet courage that often goes unnoticed. Peter, a blind boy who had every reason to give up, instead chooses to believe in himself, in a broken, frightened horse, and in the bond they share. And Tizon, scarred by a past of neglect, learns that fear doesn't last forever when someone stands beside you. There's something deeply human in that, don't you think? How often do we judge others, or even ourselves, based on what's visible? Peter couldn't see the world the way others did, but he felt it. He understood Tizon's pain because he'd lived it. Together they proved that strength isn't about what you can see or how fast you can run. It's about the heart. It's about showing up, especially when it's hard. And honestly, this story makes me think, how many of us have been like Tizon, scared, uncertain, needing someone to believe in us? And how many of us have been like Peter, daring to trust even when it seems impossible? I'd love to hear your thoughts. What part of the story resonated most with you? Have you ever had a moment where trust, either giving it or receiving it, changed everything? Drop a comment below, and let's keep the conversation going. Thanks for being here, for sharing this moment. Until next time, take care and remember, sometimes the strongest connections come when we choose to listen with our hearts, not our eyes.